So tonight we have an interesting set of issues on the cards to discuss, including, of course, the coup in Gabon. Going to be looking a little bit at that and what it might mean. And also then a turn to the latest from the Russia-NATO war in Ukraine, looking at the Ukrainian droning strategy and what that is all about, before turning to the now much promised and finally, hopefully tonight, delivered upon look at the NGO industrial complex and what does it mean. So we will begin tonight with a look at the coup in Gabon. What is it exactly is it that's going on there, and is it anything to do with any of the other events that are going on in the region? So first of all, I'm going to call up a map of the area so you can see to where I am referring. So if you can look here, you can see that Gabon is, of course, not directly bordering with any of the other countries that have these nationalist juntas that have come to power. So Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea. It doesn't border those, though of course you can see down there, because it's sandwiched between Cameroon to the north, the Republic of Congo to the south, and Equatorial Guinea immediately to the northwest. And Gabon was formerly, prior to 1960, a French colony, part of French Equatorial Africa. And it is, since 1960, it has only had three leaders, three presidents. The whole of the history of post-independence Gabon is largely defined by the two presidents who've served the longest. The second president, El Hadj Omar Bongo Ondimba, who then, when he died, was succeeded by his son in the 1990s, Ali Bongo Ondimba. And the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things, not sure how significant it is that, of course, the current president, the man who led the coup against the Bongo dynasty, is a man by the name of General Brice Chatain Oligo Nguema. And I may have mispronounced his name in a typical English fashion there, but the current leader, he is the cousin of the former deposed President Bongo, and has been a key member of the presidential administrations of both the father and the son. Now, none of this means, of course, that he can't turn against them. The other interesting things about him is that he is reported in allegations made in a newspaper in Cameroon a few years ago to have a couple of properties in Hyattsville and Silver Spring, which are areas of Maryland. Now, of course, the Bongo family, being from a rather kleptocratic administration, did have, of course, townhouses in the outer edges of Washington, D.C., apparently, some of the more high-end areas and some of the richer areas of Virginia. So this is a place where money leaves quite quickly. It's also a petrostate. Gabon is a member of OPEC, and it principally it exports an awful lot of oil, including, of course, its biggest customer being the People's Republic of China. So 70% of its export revenue come from the oil trade. The rest comes from selling timber and manganese. So it's principally an oil exporter. And in development terms, it's an interesting comparison to be made with Niger, which of course has a very high rate of illiteracy. It has a life expectancy only in the mid-50s. So Gabon has done slightly better over the years. Its literacy rate is 85%, and life expectancy is 66.5. It's still not Western levels, but it's better than what you get in Niger. And the other issue, though, there is a commonality with Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali, is, of course, that it's in the CFA franc zone. So its currency is still basically controlled by the French, though now via the European Central Bank. So that is a potential crippler in terms of the government's ability to act. The other big thing is, of course, is it has an external debt, according to the World Bank, of over 7 billion. So the precise figure is $7,198,927,676. Now, bear in mind, the population of Gabon is only just over 2 million. So, and it exports a hell of a lot of oil every year. So what exactly is it doing, borrowing all that money? Interesting question, and I'm not going to pretend that I've got the answer to this thus far. But clearly a slightly different situation than Niger. The country is a bit more stable, but in terms of its actual rate of poverty and development, it tells a fairly similar picture to other African states that have a lot of oil, particularly those who haven't gone through any kind of revolutionary process. So the UN study into what the United Nations calls multidimensional poverty, which is one of these horrible NGO terms, which I will come to comment more upon in later on in this episode. They identify the reasoning behind the use of the term multidimensional poverty. It's not a bad reason, in that what the UN is doing is it's saying that it's not just monetary poverty that counts. It's also things like access to education, access to healthcare, access to decent food. And by that measurement, quite a lot of the US and Britain are now falling into multidimensional poverty. But we'll get to that in future episodes, I'm sure. So the actual numbers when it comes to those living in poverty in Gabon is that the UN characterizes about 18.4% of the population as vulnerable to what it calls multidimensional poverty. That means that they have a low income, but not below the poverty line of, like in Gabon, it's $2.50 a day, and not in severe poverty, but they have enough to get by. They're not like starving, but they're not exactly rich, basically. They are, of course, lacking in access to healthcare and education. And of course, so what the Bongo dynasty seems to have done is it's used some of the oil money to develop education to a certain point. It's secured a slightly higher level of income for the citizens of Gabon than somewhere like Niger gets, but this is still a place where, again, according to UN figures, you have, out of a population of 2.3 million, around about 795,000 to 800,000 people living in poverty. So that's almost half the population that's characterized as living in poverty. So that's still a source of immense and grinding frustration. It should also be noted that the Bongo dynasty has been subject to mass protests at various different points during the fake elections that they've held. So in '93 there was mass protests against the father. In 2000, in the early 2000s, there were again mass protests against the son. Both times these were repressed with a great deal of state violence, including usage of like militarized police against the civilian population. So this trouble over the elections and the free and fairness of those elections has been contested by the population for quite a long time. And the population, of course, nearly half of them are characterized as living in poverty. So a lot, even though that Gabon exports all this oil, principally to China, and they're one of the most oil-rich countries in Africa, they still have this gigantic amount of external debt of over $7 billion, which I'm going to try and find out more about for future episodes. But again, what you find over and over again, if we compare this situation to somewhere like Argentina or Ecuador, different countries, but similar tactics are applied, is that what the imperialists will try and do is they'll lend a certain amount of money to a place like Gabon. And it's not lent in order to actually do anything. It's lent to get the country into debt. And then there's a good point made in an interview given by Michael Hudson, and he's talking principally about Argentina and Ecuador, but I think the same can apply to places like Gabon, which is they might have lent, that is the imperialists through their banking system, they might have lent to these countries in the 70s or the 80s, and some, or in Argentina's case, the 90s. And then everything that's come on top of that, the fact that the debt keeps going up, a lot of that has just been interest. So the debt keeps accumulating interest, and then they borrow more money to pay off the interest. And it's much like domestic debt inside the imperialist countries itself. You're not actually meant to pay it off. What you're meant to do is borrow more to pay off the interest. And this, again, was part of the gigantic Ponzi scheme with regard to mortgages in Britain and the United States. Those people borrowed that money with no realistic expectation that they were ever going to pay it off. They just had to keep making the payments to keep the money going round. With regard to lending to developing world countries or third world countries, whatever terminology you want to use, the imperialists lend the money to make sure that they remain in debt. And this seems to have been what has happened to Gabon, because in my view, there's no way that a country that has that much in terms of oil reserves needs to be that far in debt. Given that oil prices had been high for a very long time and this debt keeps accumulating, I think that what has probably happened, and again, I need to confirm this by further research, is that there's been a loan made and they keep piling interest payments upon it over and over again. And this enables, of course, the imperialists through the IMF and the World Bank and other institutions which they control, which, as we must always remember, the IMF and World Bank and World Trade Organization have no independent existence. Unlike the ridiculous claims made by people like Michael Hart and Tony Negri 20 years ago in their book Empire, which is that the international institutions had overpowered the nation state. No, these were creations of principally British and US imperialism. They're run almost exclusively now by US imperialism to enforce its terms of trade and its ability to plunge nations into debt peonage, basically. They run it on to disguise their interests, to make it look as if they're running this empire that they do run, these imperialist interests, to disguise them under in the guise of multilateral institutions, where they have no independent existence. So being in debt to the IMF is essentially a way for them to control countries like Gabon. Now, Bongo hadn't taken his country into ECOWAS, that organization that we've discussed a great deal about recently, but he had taken his country into the British Commonwealth, which is almost as bad. In fact, it is as bad. So this is something that some of the states did in response to pressure from the British. And also, we should also keep in mind that ECOWAS is a joint British and French concern. So the British and the French, even though they butt heads every now and again, are very much in this business together of suppressing the African nations. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that when Bongo was overthrown just this morning by the leader of the Presidential Guard and set up a new junta, this was something that was actually, at least seems to be legitimately popular amongst the population. There were mass crowds out waving the national flag, praising the army for taking this action. It seems that large numbers of the population, and if it is accurate, those figures from the UN, that almost 900,000 out of a 2.3 million population live in poverty, then I'm not surprised it was popular that Bongo was disposed of and now awaits. Him and his son were both arrested, along with the entire all the ministers from the cabinet were arrested, and it looks like that Bongo and his son have been charged with high treason. Now, what he's done with them, there's rumours that they're going to be transferred out to a jail in Morocco, then probably shipped off to France somewhere. Now, there have been all kinds of rumours flying around about this, including some from Russian sources, including the Telegram channel Rebar, which I followed up on. Now, Rebar, citing sources in the French DGSE, that's the French Foreign Intelligence Services, claimed that this guy, the new temporary or interim junta leader, let me just call him up again, Brice Oligui. He was, of course, has extensive connections with the US. He's rumored to own property there. He's rumored to have had extensive military training in the US. And this led the unnamed sources that Rebar was citing to claim that this was basically a CIA operation, or this was an American operation, to essentially drive the French out of a key oil-producing state and take over management of it themselves. Now, other than this unnamed French intelligence source, I didn't see any other confirmation. Now, it does seem to be true that this guy does own property in Maryland, to either 2 or 3 properties, depending upon the newspaper reports. That is based on 2 newspaper reports, again, coming from Cameroon. Now, I should also say that several of the officers in Niger and in Mali had gone through US military training. The guy who leads Guinea now, he had gone through training in the French parachutist forces. And indeed, he and his wife had also worked with the French Gendarmerie Nationale, as had many of the officers involved in the Burkina Faso coup. They'd all gone through French military training. None of this necessarily means that they are puppets of one imperialist power or another. Often it's the case that if there's pressure coming up from the masses, as we've said before with reference to the situation in Niger, that the generals, or at least some in the officer corps, can get affected by that and decide to jump themselves in terms of overthrowing the despised former ruler and try and institute some new sort of nationalist revolution from above. That's certainly what's happened in Niger, where it's obvious that there was an explosion of frustration and relief, in fact, when Bazoum was overthrown by Chiani and the other military leaders in Niger. So even though this guy who's overthrown Bongo was the head of the presidential guard, had been in the government a long time, had extensive connections with the United States, even if that is all true, and if indeed he is a property owner in the United States, none of that rules out the fact that he was responding to pressure from the Gabon masses. Even these like army guys who might have slightly shady pasts, might have had dealings with the US military and US intelligence, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that these characters do get radicalized or do try and respond to pressure from below with a revolution from above to try and secure the long-term viability of the system that they're a part of. And this is the problem when you get interpretations like this one that Rebar seems to have engaged in. They didn't have any actual evidence that this character is working for the CIA or that this was a play by the Americans. It was one unnamed French intelligence official that was making this claim. Now, the claim that the Americans are behind it was a claim I saw also made about Niger. And that seems to be completely false because the Americans are panicking about it, according to reports that have come out of South Africa and other places with regard to the tour of the US Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who seemed to be apparently panicked when she was running around West Africa and South Africa trying to find supporters for the restoration of Bazoum in Niger. So my guess is that what has happened here is that you have had a long-term situation in Gabon where the nation is in a, as Ash in the comments has put it, debt trap imposed upon it by the imperialists and also indulged in by Bongo and his corrupt clique, and there was an increasing number of the masses in Gabon who nearly half the population judged even by the UN figures as living in poverty, maybe not like the desperate poverty that some others in the region would live in, but still frustrating and grinding poverty when you've got a nation that exports a ton of oil into the world market and should be very, very rich. It should have some of the highest living standards in the African continent, but it's in all this debt and it's subject to the whims of the Washington consensus, namely cut services, cut wages, and sell assets to US companies or corporations from the US bloc. So it seems to me that what's happened is a combination of things. You have this ongoing situation with regard to the giant amount of debt that Gabon is in. You have the situation with regard to the masses there, where nearly a million of them live in poverty. You have a corrupt government run by a family that's been there since the 1960s. And you have an increasing radicalization sweeping through West Africa, from Burkina Faso and Guinea to Mali and now Niger. You have instability and anti-French protests breaking out everywhere. I think that what's happened is that one of these guys, or a combination of the senior military officers, have decided to act before the situation in Gabon escalates in terms of the action coming from a revolution from below. They have decided that they're going to act, get rid of the ruling dynasty, and I don't know what their intentions are. It's not completely clear at this stage, but I would argue that the radicalization in the region and pressure from the masses has been what has led to this being carried out. Now, their intentions will become clear in time, as will the actions of French and US imperialism to them. I would also add that the kind of people who tell you that the hand of the US imperialists are behind absolutely every single thing are exactly the same people who will tell you that there's no hope and no way out, because these people have no faith in the masses. They don't believe in the creativity of the masses. Communists must analyze better than that. And I would argue that, of course, and as I have gone into before, the arguments that the events 10 years ago in Tunisia and Egypt were all a US plot, that was proven to be demonstrably false as well. The imperialists can act and do act in a brutal fashion whenever they feel their interests are threatened. But when you have mass mobilizations of the proletariat and peasantry, and they are, of course, engaged in a revolutionary process, yes, the imperialists can create all manner of problems. They can try and divert it. They can throw barriers in its way. They can even try and bloodily repress it. But they find it very, very difficult to overcome this kind of mass resistance. It's only when the revolutionary tide ebbs, when its strength weakens, when it becomes divided by its own failure of leadership or complete lack of leadership, that's the moment that the imperialists can act the most effectively, when the masses have ebbed, when the tide has ebbed, when the objective has either appears to have been secured, or there is a division there, like there was in Egypt in 2011, when you got rid of Mubarak, but then you had the movement fall into several different camps, some of whom wanted Mohamed Morsi, some of whom wanted a Nasserist restored, some of whom wanted basically the Mubarak system without Mubarak. And because there was no revolutionary party there worthy of the name, there were several Trotskyite groups there, though. Well, Trotskyites or CIA agents, make your choice. But the key thing to bear in mind is that it was when that movement fractured, when there was no leadership, when the proletariat retracted back into its shell again and stopped taking mass action, at that point the imperialists could act through their chosen man at the time, al-Sisi in Egypt, and he was able to bring back essentially the Mubarak system without Mubarak. Now, how is all of this relevant with regard to Gabon? There are people who will tell you that there's a hidden hand behind everything, that there's the CIA's behind everything, and I would say that you need to analyze the role of the masses far more. And it is clear that there was a role played here by a wave of radicalization sweeping its way through West Africa. Now, how this works out in Gabon, I don't know as yet. It's still less than 24 hours gone after the overthrow of President Bongo. So this is something to keep an eye on. It is a situation that will evolve rapidly, I think, and it may discourage the imperialists from trying to launch ECOWAS's intervention force into Niger, because if there's going to be more disturbances and more military coups in more countries, there was already talk of some kind of coup that was prevented in Senegal. There's rumblings constantly in places like the Ivory Coast. It could be that if they try and stage an intervention in Niger, then the rest of the West African countries could be under threat as well, because it's clear that every time one of these guys falls who's aligned with the imperialists, the response of the masses is to be overjoyed, because they feel like there's a chance of securing at least more sovereignty for themselves, of chasing out the corrupt cliques who've run the countries on behalf of French and ultimately US imperialism since the 1960s. So West Africa is going to be a tremendously important region in terms of the future trajectory of the world revolution. And this is something that we should all keep an eye on. And I'm going to be including it in the update every day, I think, from now on, because this is not going to end for quite some time to come. There's a revolutionary process that needs to play itself out in a lot of these countries. And for places like Burkina Faso, where the more radical end of these movements seems to be resident, there's a lot of interesting things happening there. In other news from West Africa, the Malian government passed a law earlier today or late yesterday, stating that their government share of the mining industry has to go up to 35%. Now, this isn't exactly Bolshevik-style radical takeovers, but what it represents is, of course, where this movement has got to inside Mali, which is it's an attempt not at like bringing in socialism or anything like that at this stage. Where they are at the moment is that they are trying to assert some basic sovereign rights over the income that is generated via the mining and the exploitation of natural resources in places like Mali. And again, not exactly radical, because previously the government held, I believe, 25%. So they've upped the stake to 35%, which is expected to generate billions more in revenue. Now, whether this succeeds, whether the companies flounce out. Recently in Burkina Faso, there was footage released of the French mining companies trashing all their equipment and before they quit the country, which is the kind of people you're dealing with here. They go there and exploit and abuse these nations, then throw a strop on the way out. But I'm sure that President Traoré isn't too bothered about seeing them go. So, again, to re-emphasize the point, tremendously important events in West Africa, has to be followed closely. I'm going to be doing my best to cover it on a daily basis, and please join me for that going forward. So I'll now pause and just dive into the comments again. So hello to Austin from the Evil Empire, USA. Well, Empire of Lies, according to Putin, though I think we're part of the Empire of Lies with you. With regard to the monetization, yes, it is recording monetization from the streams. YouTube's saying that that it's generating ad money. Now, if they actually pay out that money is another question entirely. So if they do, then I'll keep the ads on for now. If they basically turn around and say, oh, well, you can't have it because of X, Y, and Z, then I'll turn them all off again, basically. And that's also why I'm doing, there's completely ad-free audio versions on the Patreon page. So, now saying hello to Burke and hello to Kent in Minneapolis. That was quite interesting. So what has been going on recently is that yesterday there was the strikes on a Russian military airfield in a place in western Russia called Pskov. And this was another strike done by drones. It was an attempted strike on Russian military transport planes. And this was something which was subject to wild speculations from numerous people about whether these were launched from the Baltic states, whether they were launched from Ukraine. It seems that they were launched from Ukraine. I don't think even the yapping dogs of the Baltic are stupid enough to imagine that they could launch drones from their airspace and not be noticed. But it fits in with the warfare that's been designed for the Ukrainians, principally by the British, which is that they're escalating these basically pinprick harassment attacks on Russian infrastructure that they hope will, I don't know, do something to, I don't know, maybe Putin will see a drone coming in and say, oh my God, it's over, I surrender. Principally, I think the reason why they're doing this is to essentially look as if they're doing something. They're desperate to make it appear as if they're striking back against the Russians in a meaningful way, because in reality, they can't hit inside Russia too much. They can, of course, shell places like Belgorod. They can, of course, shell the new Russian territories and drop cluster munitions on Donbass. But in terms of hitting Moscow, in terms of hitting St. Petersburg, their options are very limited, which is why they've been trying these drone swarms recently. And this, of course, fits in with what we've talked to friend of the show, Kit Clarenberg, about, which is the usage of this sort of British special operations manual by the Ukrainian forces to target the Kerch Bridge to Crimea, to launch drone assaults on Russian cities, to try and launch sabotage offensives inside Russia itself. Now, what I would argue they're actually doing here is preparing the ground for ultimately some kind of long-term guerrilla campaign. Because if you look at the results from the battlefield, and again, there's claim and counterclaim regarding Rabotino, but not a lot else going on at the moment. There is progressive Russian movements up in the north in the Kharkov region on the front line. But again, like the Ukrainian offensive just seems to have completely petered out. Well, rather bloodily petered out, as it turns out. And the question, therefore, has to be inside Russia itself. And that this is something which is going to be the preserve of, well, mainly the British are going to be directing it. It seems to be them that are obsessed with this idea that they can run some sort of long-term terroristic guerrilla strategy that's going to somehow reduce Putin to a quivering wreck. And again, this is all confirmed in the leaked documents that we've talked to Kit Clarenberg about on a couple of occasions. So again, this is the main story at the moment, other than the slow Russian advance up in the north, and other than the things I mentioned yesterday regarding a potential Russian assault in the winter time. That's being talked about quite a lot by Russian sources at the moment. The idea that they're going to make some move in the winter when the ground hardens up, because apparently in the near future we'll have the rainy season in Ukraine, followed by a hardening of the ground in the winter, and at that point some kind of offensive might take shape. Now, there was rumors of this last year, but it of course didn't amount to anything. There's more concrete talk about it this year, coming from actual sources inside the Russian military itself. So again, we may be facing a situation where the Ukrainian offensive, having been a bloody and disastrous failure, is then followed up by an actual Russian offensive. Now, whether that takes the shape of anything more dramatic, or whether the Russians choose to continue using the slow and grinding tactics that they've been specializing in until now, again, we'll have to wait and see on that one. Whether the Russians are going to go for some kind of knockout punch is another question entirely. Now that apparently the Ukrainians are going to try and use some sort of mass mobilization to basically fill up the gaps in their line, we're going to see what strength the Ukrainian state actually has left in it as to how popular this mobilization is and whether it's resisted in any way. So I'll come back to these questions tomorrow. But the thing I wanted to go into and spend about 20 minutes or more discussing is, of course, the role of the NGO sector in the current world, and more specifically its usage by imperialism. And this was prompted by reports that we've done recently with regard to the role of the Red Cross in like a place like, well, for instance, Haiti. So there was talk recently of like, oh, we're going to donate to the Red Cross to help Hawaii. And this was, of course, something that Barack Obama was plugging. And it was pointed out by Max Blumenthal that the Red Cross raised $500 million for the Haiti earthquake back in 2010, but they spent 25% of that money on internal administration costs. They only built around about 6 houses for Haitians, and the rest of the money, it's not clear what they did with it. So this, of course, is a fairly typical example and of how charities actually operate. So $500 million amounting to 6 homes being built. That's 6 as in the number 6. And not 6,000, not 600, not 60, but 6. And a quarter of the money goes on administrative costs and nobody knows what happens to the rest. That's actually pretty typical of the way in which money has been spent by a lot of charities, especially those that get flooded with donations. A lot of it goes just to keep the operation going, and then a lot more of it gets spent on God knows what. Now, what I would argue is that the way in which the charities have been structured since the 70s really have it's been indicative of the way in which imperialism has chosen to change its messaging and its propaganda. Because, of course, as Marx observed as early as the Communist Manifesto, in places like Britain and the United States and others, where there was poverty and misery, there sprung up a series of liberal do-gooders, charitable institutions, Christian missionary types who used to try and take God and a cup of tea into the miserable inner cities. So these institutions have always been there. Now, what about their specific usage by imperialism? Well, the old school imperialism of the colonial period, of course, a lot of it used to rely on, when it came to cultural propaganda by the imperialists, they had to rely, of course, on the established churches. So it was no coincidence that from the earliest period of European colonialism, Christian missionaries accompanied, of course, Columbus himself to the Caribbean and into all the conquistador expeditions into the interior of South America. And the idea was they were going to convert the natives in order to better educate them in the way of the world, which largely involves submission to the Europeans. And this is what the British used the Anglican missionaries for in India. It's what they used them for in the African nations, with the idea that they were going to preach what exactly? That in the words of, I believe it was Julius Nyerere, who the leader of Tanzania, who said, when the missionaries arrived, they had the Bible and we had the land. They told us to close our eyes and pray, and then when we opened our eyes, we had the Bible and they had the land. So that's a amusing joke, but it of course reflects a reality. And of course the usage of institutional Christianity by imperialism was very extensive, and it was used to preach like submission, meekness, wait for the kingdom of heaven, live with the misery you have right now in order that you may be rewarded in the future. It's the same thing they preach to the poor in Europe, by the way. They just did it with ever greater ferocity in Africa, because of course the misery being inflicted upon them by the European colonial powers was even greater. Now, in the time of neo-colonialism, the established churches of the West kind of started to lose a little bit of their luster. Now, the Catholic Church and the various Protestant churches are still very strong in any African nations, as is, of course, Islam in a lot of places. But the imperialists decided that they needed a better approach. Now, of course, it's important to remember that the US imperialists still pursue a twin-track strategy. They still fund religious radical organizations, or at least they did until fairly recently in places like Uganda, and this was one of George W. Bush's favorite tricks. At the same time now, they fund propaganda organizations via NGOs that preach the good word of, shall we say, the institutional left in the United States. So now the propaganda message put out there by the US imperialists is a lot more to do with individual rights. They having funded organizations that preached rabid homophobia in places like Uganda for many years. They now fund organizations who say they want to organize the LGBTQ plus community to pursue human rights and gay rights, women's rights, rights to abortion. Name a social issue that's become a hot button issue for the NGO and academic industrial complex in the United States, and they're now exporting it to African nations and Southeast Asian nations, South American nations, to essentially make propaganda out of, and of course lure people in to be trained in, well, outsourced bits of the CIA. So for instance, USAID or various other institutions that do the work that the CIA doesn't like to do out in the open anymore because its reputation's too bad. So like USAID is one of those. You've got various British institutions like the British Council who do similar things. These are cultural propaganda campaigns which are designed to bring in people, particularly those who are younger, who have perhaps been through the university system or who have been for an education overseas, train them in advocacy for human rights and things like that, and essentially establish their worldview as being wholly that of the bourgeois of the imperialist nations. It's exporting the bourgeois worldview from the United States or Britain or to a certain extent France or the European nations and taking it into these countries with the idea that once you've trained these people, once you've made them basically a political cadre, which is what they're doing. It's what the USA, the National Endowment for Democracy, and other organizations like them do. They're training political cadre who are the organizers who are going to go out there and essentially spread the influence of the imperialist countries via using the language now of human rights, democratic freedoms, rights for sexual minorities, rights for women, things like that. This is the replacement for Anglicanism, Protestantism of other varieties, Catholicism, and this is the more effective way of reaching the people who the US and the British and the French imperialists want to influence inside these nations. And so getting them engaged in the NGO complex is a really good way of actually exercising influence there. That, and of course the NGO complex acts as a training school for many, many people who come out of university or who take a summer break from university or perhaps a year off and go work for an NGO in either the African nations or South America. And when I was at university 20 years ago, this was incredibly common even back then. So I knew many, many people who were doing all kinds of courses, not just like politics or international relations, but the hard sciences, it was, or any other subject, it didn't really matter because this was seen to be a great way of enhancing your career. In fact, I remember being present at a speech given by the Vice Chancellor, Nancy Rothwell, her name was, of the University of Manchester, was talking about the things that the biggest employers in the country, the most prestigious employers in the country, such as the big NGOs or the City of London or the big public sector employers who are looking for managers, what they're looking for on a curriculum vitae is evidence that you've got some sort of social conscience, evidence that you've given something back. Now, this has always been part of the rhetoric of the British bourgeois. You know, you would, attend a soup kitchen in the East End of London, trying to contain your contempt and horror at the visions in front of you, serve a couple of bowls of soup to a tramp, and then go back and say, I have done my bit, I have given something back. And this has now been elevated into corporate speak, but it's essentially the same thing. It's the employers have decided that this is one of the things that they like to see is that you have got this in your skill set, that you can go to Uganda or Ethiopia or Rwanda. These were the popular destinations when I was at university, when I started as an undergraduate 20 years ago. And you could go over there and you could, hug a crying child, and you could empathize with some poverty-stricken people, and maybe you could dig a latrine or something, or you could dig a ditch. I knew one guy who went and volunteered for a summer in, I believe it was an NGO that covered Chile, which is a bit strange given that Chile is a much more developed country. And he told me that they went over there, they literally dug in like a quarter of an irrigation ditch and spent the rest of the time wandering around the country, getting drunk and getting into various shenanigans, shall we say. And this was the same thing that the characters I knew who went to Uganda on like fair trade missions, on human rights missions. This is all essentially a party that these narcissists went over there to do. I remember, and this will make your skin crawl right off your body, this particular anecdote. But I was at a fair trade event in my university. It must be 16 years ago now, and there's three of the whitest people I've ever seen. These three white girls who'd been to, I believe it was Kenya. They came on and they started doing like a tribal song and dance, apparently, that they learnt from the native peoples there, and they wanted to bring it to us. And like at that point, you could tell that there was a clear class distinction in the audience, because me being from probably the more upper end of the working class, but still the working class, and some of the more working class people there just started laughing because it was ridiculous. It's like you've got three of these absurdly wealthy buffoons coming on and doing like African tribal singing and dancing, and it was like I just thought this was insane. But then again, you saw the posher types down the front of the crowd, like nodding along and getting emotional about it, going, oh yes, oh yes. And I just thought, this is bizarre. This is just completely off. Oh, this is off the peg insane. I cannot take this seriously, but a lot of people were. And of course, what you come to realize is that this is all part of career building. A lot of these people who I kept in touch with for a number of years on Facebook and places like that, all went on to have careers, again, in the NGO sector, which is a big employer in Britain, because the NGOs which deal with particularly overseas issues, they all get funding from the Foreign Office or the former Department for International Development, which has now been rolled into the Foreign Office. And essentially, part of it is a jobs program for the elite, but the other part, the bigger part, is of course it's exercise. It's an exercise in influence building, as I said before, building up networks inside these nations which you can later call upon to exercise the influence of British imperialism or US imperialism, and getting people in the ruling circles and ruling classes of these countries who are tied to Britain or tied to France or tied to the USA by both financial and strong cultural ties. Make it so that the people who rise to the top in these countries have more in common with the British ruling class than they do even with the national bourgeoisie of a place like Kenya, or never mind the proletariat and the peasantry there. And so NGOs are a great way to exercise that influence. So that's one of the big reasons why the NGO sector has grown so vastly in recent years. And the other one is, of course, that it's a great way of masking things. And this is particularly true when you consider the role, of course, of Mr. Bob Geldof and Bono and all the other unbearable arseholes that were part of the Live Aid business, and it was a business, that ran all the way through the 80s and, of course, came back in the form of the excruciating Live 8 in the 2000s. And this was, of course, spawned, if you weren't familiar with it, by the reports of a genuine famine in Ethiopia in the early 1980s, in 84, I believe it was, reported on by this notorious reactionary news broadcaster for the BBC, this guy called Michael Burke. And he was reporting upon this and was like, oh, this is terrible. Look what this Marxist regime has done. Because, of course, Ethiopia at the time was run by an administration with the acronym the Derg, headed by a guy called Mengistu Haile Mariam, who called himself a Marxist at various different stages. We can get into the career of Mengistu in future episodes. But when you dig into it, you discover that, of course, Ethiopia had suffered from famines also at the time of the old king, Haile Selassie. And there was, on average, there was a famine every 10 years or so, going back many, many years. And of course, it was presented as this unique thing that this horrific Soviet-aligned country had done. Now, I'm not going to come here and make excuses for Mengistu. I think that government had an awful lot wrong with it, and certainly didn't solve many of the problems that were confronting the Ethiopian masses, which is why ultimately it fell. But to pretend that, of course, this was the unique creation of these awful Marxists was, of course, a lie. Now, jumping off of that, of course, Mr. Geldof and Mr. Bono, and if we've got any Irish people in the chat tonight, I fear if I have to apologise for Phil Collins, you certainly have to apologise for Bono and Geldof. But the role that they played, of course, was in the sort of whipping up this sort of celeb fest. And it was, as Geldof says, and I won't do the accent, just give us your fucking money. Now, it's an off-the-cuff remark from Geldof, but that this became the sort of emotive exhortation every time the British bourgeois wanted to do something with regard to an imperial campaign. It was, oh, we just have to do something. Look at these horrible images. Look at what these horrendous dictators are doing to these people. Britain must act. And of course, this was all wrapped up inside the goings-on of the charity industrial complex, who were frequently like the people on the ground who were featured in British news reports. I'm certain the same is true of the United States when it comes to like places like Haiti or places like Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan. Remember, the NGOs played a big role in portraying the war in Sudan as the actions of this awful dictator, Omar Bashir, who, again, there's a lot wrong with the regime run by Bashir. But the charity industrial complex, of course, headed up by like celebrity CIA-connected Hollywood people like George Clooney, campaigned essentially for the separation of Sudan into North and Southern Sudan. Now, it is true, of course, that Sudan's borders were drawn by the British imperialists in the period when they had to leave in the 50s and early 60s. And, of course, there were different ethnic groups, different religions within Sudan, and that, of course, contained the potential for trouble. But, of course, this trouble was deliberately whipped up by the imperialists over many, many years in order that they could ultimately pursue their real aim, which was the separation of the country into two different, more easily managed parts. And of course, the separation hasn't actually solved any problems for the Sudanese, given that the northern part of the former Sudan, North Sudan, is now subject to competing military factions fighting it out over who gets to rule the place, and there's been a civil war in South Sudan anyway. So this didn't actually solve anything. Strangely enough, George Clooney lied to us. But this was all brought to us by the charity industrial complex, the NGO complex. They were the ones who were giving the teary accounts of the awful atrocities of the Bashir dictatorship. And of course, Bashir did commit crimes. There's not much doubt about that. But the actual contextualization, the actual true situation within Sudan, the role of the various different rebel groups and the alignment of some of them with the imperialists and what was essentially going on in that civil war, that was never presented. What you got was tearful white person on TV crying about how awful the dictator was and something must be done. And that's a pattern that's repeated on news broadcasts whenever they want to do something, the imperialists that is, in certainly African nations. Crying white person, Used to be that they would feature largely women. Now they feature crying men as well, telling you how awful something is. Won't somebody please think of the children? Britain must act. Same script over and over and over again. And then you dig into the charities that operate there. They're all linked to either the British state via funding grants in some way or another. The American state has the same operation. And then we get to the question of how these supposedly charitable, oh so munificent and beneficial institutions actually act when they get to a country. And here we go back to the unhappy example of Haiti, where of course Oxfam, British charity, was done several times for their officials, essentially running child sex rings in Haiti for many, many years. And that their officials were essentially living like British colonial officials in like India in the 1800s or something. They were having women and children brought to them at their villas for horrendous perversions, shall we say. The Oxfam workers were essentially running sex trafficking rings in Haiti. They were involved in trafficking women and children out of the country to other places. And it was an internal Oxfam report found several years ago that the charity had been guilty of essentially running a giant sex ring when they were supposed to be going to Haiti to help people. Just as the Red Cross raised all that money, $500 million, then built only 6 houses in Haiti itself, spent a quarter of it on their own administrative costs, and then won't say what they did with the rest of it. Now, what did they do with the rest of it? That is an open question. I'm sure there's some investigations on that somewhere, and we'll try and dig out more info on it. But when you look at the overall picture regarding the charity industrial complex overseas in countries subjected to imperialism, they act as essentially colonial officials. Only they do it behind a mask of independent organizations. But again, all of these are funded by the US and the British and French and other imperialist countries. They act to further the influence of the imperialists. They act as training schools for the next generation of governmental elites in these countries. They act as CV boosters for like foul narcissists in Western universities. And these are an integral part in the imperialist management system. Now, when it comes to the operations of the NGO complex in the United States itself or in Britain, what you find is that the role of charities has been boosted significantly since, of course, the Thatcher and Reagan era and the cutbacks to state provision that were made during that time. And what you find that the NGOs are being used for, particularly in the United States, but it's happened in Britain as well, is that they are used to essentially, they are given grants by either federal or state governments to basically manage parts of the population that have fallen into either extreme poverty or addiction. And this is part of the controversies that arose in California, I believe, regarding the sheer number of people who have become addicted to various drugs who are on the streets. And this came out, I believe, on it was Michael Schellenberger, who's a reactionary. He's an old liberal, but he's a reactionary. But he came out with some research on this that was actually correct, in that his numbers that he was presenting were true, which is that the charity system inside the United States, the NGO system, gets grants from the Californian state government. And it's essentially what they do is, rather than assisting any of these addicts on the streets, they essentially use the money to preserve the institution itself as essentially a bureaucratic entity and a jobs program, and what they do with the people is they maintain them inside a system of addiction and homelessness by giving them needles, by giving them access to like slightly lesser versions of the drugs that they are on, and by like building slightly more elaborate homeless encampments for them. And when Schellenberger said that, well, these people aren't interested in solving the problem, well, he's actually right. The NGOs in California and other places in the United States where you've got these large numbers of people who are either homeless or in a situation of extreme economic precariousness, who might be addicted to something, who suffer from all manner of psychological problems. The NGOs, which are, of course, in the United States, linked with the institutional left and the Democratic Party, they are not interested in solving the problem. They are interested in managing it and basically continuing it in order that the organization can continue to manage it and continue to receive grants. That is true. So when Schellenberger and other people who might be reactionaries come out and say this is what the institutional left linked to the NGO sector is doing, they're exploiting a problem, not solving it, well, that claim has validity to it. Now, of course, solving the homelessness problem, solving the addiction problem in any imperialist country is not really on the agenda of either side of the political divide. It's not really on the agenda of the Democrats. They're interested in exploiting it and using it to essentially make sure that money gets funneled into their political coalition. And the Republicans are interested in exploiting it to scare more petty bourgeois people into voting for a police-led crackdown. And neither side is actually interested in the actual welfare of the people who find themselves in these situations of extreme addiction, homelessness, and all the other problems that come along with it. So these institutions, when they're deployed at these NGOs inside the borders of the imperialist countries, they're not helping the people who have fallen into lumpenization either. They're there to manage them. And of course, once they start managing them, then, of course, every bureaucracy develops its own interests and wants to replicate itself. The iron law of bureaucracy. And this is happening to a certain extent in Britain as well, but I think the problem is much more developed inside the United States. And of course, then we get to the idea of charities and NGOs, and this comes back to Marx's analysis of them as early as the Communist Manifesto. They're not there to actually make these people's lives any better. They are there to essentially provide conscience salving for the bourgeoisie and upper petty bourgeoisie. That's what they're there to do. Whereas we as communists are not interested in conscience salving. We're interested in the working class becoming the ruling class, which is why it's so disastrous for leftists to essentially start operating as charitable organizations. Because what it does is it gets you into the nexus of state grants and state funding, which I've seen happen to both leftist and trade union type organizations, where they end up going down the road of actually providing services that used to be provided by the state, and then they'll end up getting a grant from the state to essentially run food banks or assist at food banks, which of course, you can't, I don't want to see people deprived of food, for God's sake, but what a lot of the leftist organizations have started to fall into is that they've started to act as managers for this essentially state-sponsored system of charitable institutions, which are designed to cover the enormous gaps in wages that exist, so that people who are working full-time have to rely on food banks. And I've seen like trade union institutions, particularly like trades councils and unemployed workers centers, end up getting involved with this end of the charity sector, like providing essentially aid to the poverty-stricken end of the working class. And you can understand why it gets done, but it essentially sucks working class organizations into a system whereby you're helping to administer the poverty of the working class. And from the perspective of the ruling class, that's just fine. Because giving out grants to charities, even grants to trade union organizations, to administer this poverty and misery that's increasing every year, well, that's fine, because it's better to hand out the occasional grant from the state. That's much less expensive to the ruling class than paying decent wages, than building decent housing, and making sure that everybody has enough wages to actually live decently off, and there's enough decent housing to make sure that people are living secure and healthy lives. Throwing out a few grants to administer some poverty is relatively inexpensive by comparison. And of course, this is why the government loves the charity sector. It's why David Cameron, if you remember him, he was so fond of the charity sector, he wanted to make sure that more state provision was actually privatized and handed over to them. And again, this is one of his big ideas. He called it the big society. There's a guy who was involved in it who was this absolute sort of corporate con artist, fraudster, who came up with the idea of the big society. His name was Steve Hilton. And he's recently popped up and he's got his own show on Fox News now. And he's one of those like absolute shysters who talks a big game. He's like, the establishment has failed. We need new direction. We need new ideas. And what was his big idea for Britain? We're going to privatize huge elements of the state administration, including like some elements of like benefit administration, welfare administration, to use the American term, and we're going to have it administered by charities on a for-profit basis. This was his big idea. And now the guy goes around on Fox News proclaiming himself an enemy of the establishment. The grift is never ending. So this is the state of play with regard to NGOs and charities, a tool of imperialism overseas and a tool of the managed decline of working class areas at home, and not something that we should be in favor of in any respect. So I'll pause now to catch up on the comments, as I see this has generated quite a bit. So with regard to the Ukrainian question, Austin says, if they do a mass mobilization of that style, casualties most likely will skyrocket. 1 million Germans died in the last 6 to 7 months of World War II when they put anyone who could hold a gun in the army. That's true, and the German state run by the Nazis was a lot stronger than the Ukrainian state. I wonder how much it can survive if the Americans start to, shall we say, pull the plug, and or how much legitimacy it actually has left to be able to do that kind of mass call-up. Philbin says, with regard to charities, that the UN gives some of these groups literal charters. Shout out to Tusker, who's joined us. Philbin says, the narcissist of the liberal NGO Globetrotters is only exceeded by their overt disdain for the people and the countries they're, quote-unquote, helping. Some also revel in association with intelligence services. Yes, I've met all of those types in my time. Ash says, the NGO industrial complex is another way to funnel gross people to access the sex trade in these countries. Yes, and I was talking about that. Zuleika says, it's only an accent, but it was only just a bit of banter. Yes, I have heard that said in that accent, and it is as unbearable as you might imagine. Yes, Ash, I'm not surprised you wanted the vomit emoji for that dance story. I couldn't stop laughing at the time. Now, with 15, 16 years difference away from it, it seems even weirder now. Peter says, the West imperialists' new civil religion of Idpol seems to be a means of waging economic and military warfare on the nations it wishes to plunder, using naive youths to sell it. Makes me puke. Yeah, bear in mind that 150 years ago, they used to routinely, the British that is, cite the plight of Western missionaries in places like China as an excuse to send the British Navy in to bombard somewhere. And now they say, well, it's the fate of X. It's the fate of LGBT people in country X. It's the fate of the rainforest even. That's why we need to get rid of Morales. Remember that one in Bolivia? When Extinction Rebellion came out for the coup that saw Janine Áñez imposed upon Bolivia and Morales overthrown by a corrupt general who'd been paid at least $1 million by the CIA, Extinction Rebellion endorsed that. There were demonstrations that I saw in Manchester and in London back in 2018, I believe, when the coup was in progress. They were demonstrating against Morales, claiming that he was the one who'd caused the Amazon fires. That was Extinction Rebellion. And if anybody tries telling me that these people are not a direct tool of the British state, I will laugh in your face. Right, President Jesus said, good thing Clooney moved on to selling tequila. Yeah, much more honest career. Yes, Zuleika, he married, as Naylor says, Amal Clooney, who's basically a celebrity lawyer, um, who is affiliated with all kinds of dodgy international organizations, as is Clooney. Yeah. Peter says Clooney's primary acting role is playing George Clooney, compassionate guy, not a willingly cynical instrument of imperialist state propaganda at all. Yes, unless we forget a friend of Mr. Jeffrey Epstein and Ms. Ghislaine Maxwell. Mr. Clooney certainly is. Zuleika says ritualistic humiliation is such a large part of bourgeois culture, so the dance isn't a surprise. It starts in prep school, doesn't end unless they're peerized. Oh, yeah, I mean, ritualistic humiliation isn't really part of British state education. Various levels of violence are. Largely involves like having fist fights in the schoolyard, compared to what the posh types get up to, like getting punched in the face and over a football game in the schoolyard is actually quite mild by comparison. When I heard some of the stories from the public school guys over the kind of stuff that they got up to with each other, like I thought, well, having to have a fist fight every day for a few weeks at the start of secondary school is pretty mild in comparison, you know. Anything the working class kids do to each other, like, largely involves fighting and some unsavory things as well. But compared to what the British ruling class and the American ruling class get up to at private school, we've got nothing on them, really. So, I've been running for just over an hour, so I think I'm going to call it a day for this evening. Remember to submit your questions for the Q&A. That's on Saturday. And I will see you again tomorrow evening. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. You can find the full audio version of this without any ads or anything on Patreon, so please check that out. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.